You know, my wife and I actually have missed most of this conference. We left, gave ourselves 6 or 8 hours to, 8 hours to get up here, and we just arrived. For those of you old enough to remember Gilligan's Island, it was, the 3-hour tour. But we'll watch it. And if you will, we almost didn't have to be here, because there is a commonality in the experience of those connected with dyslexia for whom dyslexia has been addressed. There was a poignancy here. A poignancy as Diane spoke, or as Brian spoke, or David spoke, of feeling isolated, being different, having to struggle. But my gosh, it isn't tragic. Look at their lives. Indeed, if you had to say at the moment before conception, you who are planning this conception, would you rather they struggle all through the life and achieve this great success? Or would you rather them have that normal life that they don't struggle and yet they never achieve? They would have chosen that arc, as difficult as that was. There is nothing tragic about this. It is something to celebrate. Indeed, in this room we have the science. The Shawitzes have contributed. We have the educators. So many of you here have educated, have been educators. We have the implementation, if you will, of that educational process. And we have the success stories, the examples of what this struggle can lead to. To paraphrase St. Paul, to go from glory to greater glory. That is tremendous. I'll tell you what the tragedy is, though. The tragedy is the public policy has lagged behind. Chris Murphy was here earlier, and I really like Chris. We're working together on a mental health bill, but I was in a committee hearing, just newly elected, and we were reauthorizing the Elementary Secondary Education Act. And I kept on trying to bring up amendments germane, pertinent, supportive of the cause of dyslexia. And every single one got shot down. Now, as a parent of a dyslexic, I was about to throw a chair. Chris Murphy actually supported me on some of those amendments, and I think he was the only one on the other side of the aisle who did. Afterwards, I was incredibly frustrated. I mean, I was just so frustrated. Lamar Alexander, who's the chairman, a good man, cares about education, took me to the side, and he said, "Bill, you just arrived. Before you, no one had ever raised the issue of dyslexia. In this conference, in this committee hearing, dyslexia has exploded upon the scene. And we've never heard it before." Now think about it. What is the tragedy? The tragedy is something that affects 20% of the population, that may account for 80% of the illiteracy in our nation, had never been heard in the Senate. Therein lies the tragedy. Next week, Arnie Duncan came, Secretary of Education, to testify, and I'm still angry. As the urologists say, I was urinated off. And he came to speak. And I said, you have $1 billion budget or something like that for teaching literacy. How much do you spend upon dyslexia? And he goes, I'm not familiar of any program we have for dyslexics. Boy. That's a tragedy. Now, it's one thing to speak about senators not knowing something, or a $1 billion budget not including something like that, but bring it down to the human dimension. There's a gentleman, in my medical practice, I've run clinics in prisons, and most prisoners, when you get them off drugs, are really good people, believe it or not. They've done crime, they should do the time, but it turns out there's an unholy trinity that goes with being incarcerated. It is not having a father figure, it is being on drugs, and it is illiteracy. Now you can kind of imagine that the illiteracy leads one to the other. In fact, when Diane was speaking of how do we address income inequality, my mind's going back to that fellow who's pretty bright but can't read. I'm having to talk to him about treatment of hepatitis C, at the time fairly complex. He grasped that, then he can't sign his name on a dadgum consent form. And so indeed, one of the statistics in public policy is that you can look at your illiteracy rate in 4th grade and begin to plan for the number of prison cells you need 20 years later. That's how strong that statistical correlation is. My wife, through her work with dyslexia, by the way, you know, I'm up here talking, my wife is, if my daughter inspired us, my wife is the one who informs. So if you will, I'm a little bit, she is the ventriloquist speaking through me, I suppose, right now. And so she met a man named Amir Barak. Do I have that right, dear? Amir Baraka. And Amir had done time for manslaughter out of New Orleans. Turns out he was illiterate. He had no place to turn, incredibly frustrated and angry. And when Diane said that she doesn't know right from left, at least she can say, well, there's a sign that says Aberdeen Drive. That must be where I need to go. Amir couldn't read Aberdeen Drive. He couldn't know right from left because he couldn't look at a map and make sense of it. And there's a guy who in great love didn't know Amir, but came to the prison and reaching across cultural, social, economic, and racial divide, taught Amir how to read. Now that plus his faith in God turned Amir around. Now I say turned him around. He's an actor, he's an author, he still can't spell. I mean, my gosh, when David mentioned how he can't even get close on the spell check, that's Amir. He wrote a letter to Michelle Obama for us to deliver, and my wife looked at it, ooh, ooh, better proof this for Amir. But it came out of his heart, and that was what was matter. But he's been very successful. But there are so many people like Amir who are not reached. If you will, there is not enough to go around. So if there's a tragedy of public policy, there's a tragedy that the social economic divide is tremendous. I'm a public policy guy. I care about people who are not in this room. If you're in this room, you're Toby Cosgrove. If you're in this room, you're bright. You're advantaged. You're from a family that can bring those resources to bear for you. My wife, again, I'm her biggest fan, she decided to start a public charter school because she said if it's as hard to get our daughter accommodation when you're a congressman and a doctor, and I'm a doctor, and it's usually the mom that makes the decisions on a child's educational level, and you can look at the mama's educational level, strongly correlates with what plays out for the child. She's just throwing that whole tiger mom thing into her daughter. If it's as hard for her to get accommodation for my daughter, what if you're a single mom with 3 kids living in poverty? It ain't gonna happen. And you start planning for that prison cell 20 years later. And that potential of someone like Amir Barak, or any one of these folks that just spoke, but from a disadvantaged background, is starting to be written in a tragic way. If there's things that come out of this conference, I would hope that it would raise the profile of dyslexia so that none of my senators can say they haven't heard of dyslexia. Oh my gosh, I hope I never hear that again. And also though, that we can be made sensitive to the social economic difference for the opportunity to have your dyslexia addressed. Now, we've gone the route of a public charter school. I think I know that there are 2 functioning public charter schools in the nation, a third being started, and those 2 happen to be in Louisiana, which is not usually on the vanguard of educational achievement. On the other hand, in our state, which has a high rate of poverty and a high rate of blue-collar working-class families struggling to make ends meet, there has become a sensitivity to how do we address their needs. If you will, in our weakness, we seek for strength. So if there's something that we leave here from, if we leave, it's that let's celebrate. There is nothing tragic about being dyslexic. And if on the moment of conception your child can choose to be conceived with dyslexia with an arc of success, as those here have, or not, we would hope they would choose that arc of success. Now, our challenge here is to think of those who are not in this room, but whom our lives and our society depends upon them doing well, and to push for those wise public policies that benefit us, but also benefit them directly. Now, that is a longer conversation and a future conversation. But I thank you all for being committed to the cause of dyslexia, the cause of taking the science to connect it with the educators to bring success, not just to us, but to those who are not here. Thank you for having me.